Okay, so again, we talked about a couple of ways to modify the atmosphere to increase Earth's albedo, with one exception, right? The cirrus clouds. So here we're going to think about land-based things that can accomplish the same means or similar means. Um, so again, we're thinking about albedo and we're thinking about reflectivity. Well, one of the things that we can do, and this can have an effect, particularly heat island effect, is actually we can install or kind of have policies regarding what we call cool roofs. So cool roof is not like an awesome roof, like my roof is so cool. No, it's a roof that has increased reflectivity. And frankly, one of the things that we've started to see is that cool roof, I would even hesitate to call it a technology, but cool roof policies are things that we're starting to see kind of spreading across the globe. And so, if we look at a place like California, I know everyone likes to kind of throw rocks at California and think about all the laws that they have. But one of the policies that they have is actually for specific zones within the state. I think there's 16 or 17 different zones or places. New construction has to be built with a roof that has a certain percentage of reflectivity, right? It's a regulation. And you can think about just painting your roof white or installing lighter colored shingles. So again, I know that policy, that those regulations went into effect into 2014, and really, sure, no one likes to be told what to do. We all hate laws and all that fun stuff. But cool roof policy, in my opinion, seems to be pretty straightforward. Right? Adding that regulation, no one's going to really care. It doesn't really affect much of anything. It changes which color you pick for your roof, sure. But you have to put something on it, right? And so we may as well like encourage you to put something light in color and actually reflect more energy back rather than absorbing that energy, particularly in the case of we talked about the urban heat island effect. So I'm a fan of cool roofs. Or if I had a big foghorn, I would blow it now, or like a ship horn. So another interesting idea is the notion of basically frothing the ocean. I know that seems weird, right? But if we have a lot of ship traffic, we've got materials going back and forth across the Pacific Ocean, across the Atlantic Ocean, and there's ships driving around the place, all the time. And one of the interesting things that happen is, particularly when you look at satellite images, you can actually see ships' wakes, right? So places where the water has essentially been affected by a passing ship. If ships were outfitted with fairly cheap instruments that can essentially froth the seawater, what that would do is it would make, first of all, it's not permanent, but it would make the wake, basically, you can think about it as a wake of the ships, lighter in color, and they would persist for longer, right? Rather than the wake that's produced just by the spinning propeller that's moving our goods back and forth across these big ocean basins. So if frothing devices were added to that, those portions of the ocean would temporarily be lighter in color and again increase the reflectivity. So it has a pretty high capacity for cooling the earth. Again, we've got lots of ships and it's fairly low tech, right? It's not that difficult to install, not that difficult to do. One of the big problems, again, and we're going to start to see this over and over and over again, is most of these problems are much larger than any individual kind of nation state, right? Like these are global problems that require global solutions. Maybe a few ships would take on these frothers, but we would hope that all of them would, right? International shipping requirements would say, you have to, install these devices on your big container ships. We've got some changes to make, right? We can try to, stick our head in the sand and ignore the problem. Everyone likes to rally against GMOs, but I think that GMOs likely have at least kind of the utility of them can do some pretty big things, right? We talked about modifying GMO crops to have really long root systems, right? So they don't require so much water. They could still produce food in a drought environment. So that could be a pretty big solution. Another thing that's really interesting, and I actually wasn't really aware of this until I was in junior or senior year in college, and I started taking remote sensing classes, which you basically look at satellites and you can look at all different bandwidths of color, and you can identify different crops and things like that, even though in a kind of regular photograph, they all just look green to us. But when we start analyzing the bandwidth, we can identify and call out different crops because they give off these signature kind of reflection patterns, which means we could likely modify some of those plants genetically to be basically the same plant, but to be reflecting different wavelengths of energy. So we could increase the albedo of crops by modifying some of the genetics. Now, again, this kind of falls into the fragrant food world. I know, like I said, everyone has this knee-jerk reaction against GMOs. But again, a lot of our crops, a significant portion of our crops or crop land goes to things that we don't necessarily eat. So we grow an incredible amount of corn and soybeans that generally turns into food for cattle. I've always been confused by the mint thing, right? You drive by all these farms and they're growing mint. I'm just like, what the hell do we need so much mint for, right? But flavorings, and we do definitely use it. Obviously, there's a market for it. But those things could be interesting areas to explore. So things that we're not necessarily ingesting directly, if we're just extracting, part of the mint flavoring or the oils, I don't mind if it's GMO, but I don't speak for everyone else, right? Solar shades. So I popped on my wife's sunnies. This is another pretty far out thing to look at, but it's essentially like putting sunglasses on the earth. And it involves putting in giant, essentially permeable materials in space that actually do reduce the solar constant. So the way that this would work is we could have a lightweight kind of network, essentially maybe of triangles or hexagons or something like that. Might even need to build it out on the moon, right? Set up a little moon base and kind of assemble these things. You could have satellites trying to keep this in place. And it's material that can be fairly thin, like maybe a couple of millimeters thick. You'd obviously want light to pass through it, but it could be the giant space shade. So this is probably the most far out one, but it also gets a lot of attention because it's a giant space shade. It's got some problems, of course. So, we've got solar winds and all these things that could potentially dislodge our all-important space shade. If it were out there and something were to happen where it were to crash to Earth, we would probably have to design it out of some sort of material that would burn up really easily so that it wouldn't actually make it to Earth. It'd burn up in the atmosphere. There's, again, potentially the idea of installing isolated mirrors, right? That might be more realistic or again, reflective, thin material that's reflective. If you had a bunch of isolated mirrors, they wouldn't necessarily need to be all together in the space shade. But again, you could build a mirror factory on the moon. You would ship material up there, up to Moonbase Alpha or whatever we would want to call it, and deploy these mirrors that are reflecting or blocking some portion of that incoming solar radiation. That one's the most expensive, right? Because it involves getting all this stuff out into space. So to kind of go back through, we talked about 3 ways to do the atmosphere. Cirrus cloud reduction, increasing the whiteness or the brightness of clouds, and increasing or injecting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to increase the reflectivity or the albedo of the stratosphere. In land, we did roof covers, we GMO'd some crops, we frothed some seawater, then we installed a giant space pair of sunglasses for the Earth, right? So that's not an exhaustive list. Those are kind of, maybe the 7 biggies that you hear about the most when you start dipping into reading about geoengineering. And they've all got problems, right?